The wedding night is meant to be a pause in life's uncertainty. It is the moment people believe danger gives way to permanence. The ceremony is finished. The guests leave. The vows are no longer promises but facts. Society treats that night as protected by ritual, by law, by shared belief that whatever instability existed before has now been resolved. On October 4, 2014, Kelly Ecker stepped into that night believing the same thing. Her wedding to George Scott Sampson had been public and celebratory. Family and friends attended the ceremony and reception, watching the couple begin what was supposed to be a shared future. To everyone present, the day looked complete. There was no visible indication that the hours ahead would end in violence, but tension had already surfaced before the celebration ended. According to investigators and witness accounts, Sampson became visibly enraged during the wedding reception when his credit card was declined while attempting to pay for expenses. What may have appeared to others as an isolated outburst did not fade with the music or the toasts. That anger followed the couple home. Late that night, Kelly and Sampson returned to their house in Indiana. The guests were gone. The house entered its quiet phase, the part of the wedding night meant to belong only to the couple and their immediate family. Sampson's parents were also staying in the home. Kelly's 10-year-old son from a previous relationship was there as well. Sometime after 1:20 a.m. on October 5th, Kelly made her first emergency services call. Her voice was panicked. She told the dispatcher she was frightened and that her husband had a gun. Over the next several minutes, she placed 3 to 4 calls in total. Each one reflected escalating fear. In the final call, dispatchers heard Kelly screaming. Then they heard multiple gunshots. The call ended abruptly. Those recordings would later become one of the most critical pieces of evidence, not because they explained motive, but because they captured the exact moment when the assumed safety of the wedding night collapsed. In her panic, Kelly gave the dispatcher the wrong address. The house itself was unmarked, making it difficult for responding officers to locate it. As police searched the surrounding area, precious time passed. Investigators later confirmed that the address confusion and lack of clear markings caused an approximate 15-minute delay in reaching the home. When officers finally arrived, they were met by Sampson's parents, who were inside the house. They directed the police into the residence. What officers found confirmed the worst outcome. Kelly Ecker was discovered dead in her bedroom. She had been shot multiple times with a .40 caliber handgun. Nearby, her 10-year-old son was also inside the home. According to some reports, he was found in the same room as his mother's body. He was physically unharmed, but the proximity ensured the trauma would not be abstract or distant. In the basement, officers located George Scott Sampson. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound caused by a different weapon, a .45 caliber firearm. Investigators concluded that after killing Kelly, Sampson went downstairs and ended his own life. There was no evidence of an intruder, no signs of forced entry, no indication that the violence came from outside the household. The sequence of events, supported by the emergency calls, ballistic evidence, and scene reconstruction, led authorities to officially classify the incident as a murder-suicide. Because Sampson died at the scene, there would be no criminal trial, no courtroom testimony, no verdict. The legal process ended with the investigation, leaving only reports, recordings, and the irreversible finality of what had occurred. Kelly did not die without warning. She recognized danger. She reached out repeatedly for help. She attempted to interrupt what was happening inside her own home. The tragedy lies not in silence, but in delay, caused by panic, confusion, and the difficulty of locating the house in the early morning hours. The presence of multiple people inside the home makes the case even more unsettling. This was not a private confrontation hidden from others. Sampson's parents were there. A child was there. The violence took place under the same roof as family members who believed the wedding marked a moment of stability. It did not. As we approach the next case, I'd really appreciate it if you could please take a moment to support my channel by hitting the like button and subscribing. Thanks for the support. Second case. Chino, California, was quiet late on the night of December 14, 2019. In a residential neighborhood, music drifted over fences, laughter carried through the air, and lights glowed from a private home hosting a wedding reception. Inside and around that house, friends and family were celebrating a marriage that had taken place earlier that day. It was past midnight, edging into December 15th, the part of the night when formal schedules dissolve and only celebration remains. No one there was thinking about danger. This was a wedding night, an event built on openness, familiarity, and trust. At the center of that celebration was Joe Melgoza, a 30-year-old groom who had already spent an entire day being present for everyone else. Like many weddings, the day had been long and emotionally full. The ceremony, the photos, the greetings, the responsibility of making sure guests felt welcomed. By the time the reception was underway at the private residence, Joe was exhausted in the way grooms often are, happy, relieved, and ready to relax. The environment reflected that mood. Guests danced freely. People moved between indoor and outdoor spaces. Music was loud enough to blur conversations. Doors and gates were open. The assumption was simple. Anyone there belonged there. That assumption allowed the incursion to happen unnoticed. Roni and Josue Castaneda lived nearby. Hearing the celebration, they entered the reception uninvited. No one stopped them. No one questioned why they were there. In the context of a wedding, strangers are rarely treated as threats. They are assumed to be friends of friends, distant relatives, or acquaintances drifting through the crowd. The brothers blended in easily. They danced. They mingled. They even took photos with guests. For a time, they were indistinguishable from everyone else sharing the night. One of those moments would later matter more than anyone could have imagined. After spending time inside the reception, the brothers left. The party continued without interruption. Music kept playing. Guests kept dancing. Joe Melgoza continued doing what hosts do late into the night, checking in, laughing, moving through conversations, unaware that the celebration had already been breached once. Later, the brothers returned. This time, they did not try to blend in. They positioned themselves behind a fence bordering the property and began shouting taunts toward Joe and members of his family. The tone was openly hostile. The words cut through the music. What had been background noise became confrontation. It was now well past midnight. Guests were tired. Emotions were heightened. Alcohol had been present. Judgment, under those conditions, is rarely sharp. Joe noticed the taunting. Weddings create a specific kind of vulnerability at moments like this. The instinct is not to assume lethal danger. It is to contain the disruption, protect the guests, and keep the celebration intact. Calling the police feels like an overreaction. Walking away feels like surrender. Joe, along with several family members, jumped the fence to confront the brothers directly. It was not impulsive bravado. It was the reflex of someone responsible for the space and the people inside it. The brothers were armed with baseball bats. The confrontation turned physical almost immediately. Shouting gave way to chaos. Guests screamed. Some tried to intervene. Others froze, struggling to understand how a wedding had turned violent in seconds. During the struggle, a family member managed to wrestle one bat away from the attackers, a detail later confirmed in the official case summary. The scene fractured into fragments, movement, panic, confusion, without any clear boundary between celebration and harm. Joe Melgoza was unarmed. As the fight shifted away from the fence, Joe chased the brothers into a nearby yard. Away from the crowd and the music, he was struck. The blows caused catastrophic, blunt force trauma to his head. When police arrived around 2:20 a.m., Joe was found there, gravely injured. He died within minutes. The night that had begun as a wedding celebration ended as a homicide scene. Joe was not the only victim. During the violence, the bride's brother, Juan Bustamante, was also seriously injured. The attack left multiple people harmed, spreading trauma across the family in a single, irreversible moment. Witnesses later reported seeing the brothers flee by hopping back over the fence after the attack, carrying a single baseball bat. That bat was never recovered. When officers secured the scene, the contrast was stark. Decorations still hung. Music had stopped abruptly. Guests stood in shock, some crying, others silent. The bride was still in her wedding dress. The private residence, chosen for intimacy and comfort, had become a crime scene. Investigators moved quickly to reconstruct what had happened. Witness statements aligned. Timelines were built. Then came a detail that directly contradicted the brothers' claims. After Josue Castaneda was arrested, police found a photo booth picture from the wedding in his pocket. Despite his assertion that he had never been at the reception, The photograph placed him inside the celebration earlier that night. A keepsake meant to preserve joy became key forensic evidence. The case moved slowly through the legal system, as violent crime cases often do. Years passed between the night of the attack and its resolution. For Joe Melgoza's family, that passage of time did not dull the loss, it prolonged it. In February 2023, a jury convicted Ronnie and Josue Castaneda of second-degree murder, along with assault charges related to the injuries suffered by Juan Bustamante. In April 2023, both brothers were sentenced to 15 years to life for the murder, with additional time imposed for the assault convictions. The verdict and sentencing confirmed what the evidence had shown from the beginning. The brothers entered uninvited, returned armed, initiated the confrontation, and killed an unarmed groom. The third case. For nearly 13 years, the case remained unresolved. Then, on January 30th, 2025, Arnoldo Jimenez was captured in Monterrey. Following his arrest, he was officially removed from the FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. He remains in the custody of Mexican authorities, specifically the Fiscalía General de la República, while extradition proceedings continue. Legal experts noted at the time of his arrest that extradition to the United States typically takes 9 to 12 months, particularly when a suspect contests the transfer, as Jimenez has done. Once returned to Illinois, he is expected to face a state charge of first-degree murder in Cook County, along with a federal charge of unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. The arrest closed a long chapter of uncertainty, but it did not begin the story. That story starts more than a decade earlier, with Estrella Carrera, a 26-year-old mother living in the Chicago area. On May 11, 2012, Estrella married Jimenez in a civil ceremony at Chicago City Hall. The wedding was brief, formal, and largely private. There was no extended engagement and no large public gathering. Several members of Estrella's family did not know she had married that day. By the time the ceremony ended, the marriage was legally complete, documented, and irreversible. Later that evening, the newly married couple attended a wedding celebration with friends. The gathering appeared ordinary and calm. Estrella wore a silver sequined cocktail dress rather than a traditional wedding gown, appropriate for an evening reception. Photographs from the celebration show her smiling, relaxed, and surrounded by people who believed they were witnessing the start of a new life chapter. There were no visible arguments, no disruptions, and no signs that the night would end in violence. But the events of that night happened under a kind of pressure that cannot be measured by a clock. Psychological time moves differently. As the evening progressed, each completed milestone narrowed the space for reconsideration. The vows had been spoken. The celebration had happened. The marriage had been witnessed. In psychological terms, exits that might have felt possible earlier, delay, separation, and reconsideration no longer seemed available. The future was no longer abstract. It had arrived all at once. In the early hours of May 12, 2012, Estrella and Jimenez left the celebration together. They entered Jimenez's black 2006 Maserati and began driving toward Estrella's condominium in Burbank, a quiet suburb southwest of Chicago. Investigators later determined that the attack occurred inside the vehicle. Estrella was stabbed 18 times. The confined interior of the car meant there were no witnesses and no opportunity for outside intervention. No emergency calls were placed, and no public disturbance was reported along the route. After the stabbing, Estrella was brought into her home. When police later entered the condominium, they found her body in the bathtub. She was still wearing the silver sequined cocktail dress from the wedding celebration. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no damaged locks. The scene pointed inward rather than outward. The person who brought her into the apartment had not broken in. He had arrived with her. The crime was not discovered immediately. The following day, Estrella was supposed to pick up her children. She was the mother of a 9-year-old daughter from a previous relationship and a 2-year-old son, whom she shared with Jimenez, who was the child's biological father. When she did not arrive and could not be reached, concern escalated quickly. Family members attempted to contact her repeatedly. When those efforts failed, police were called to conduct a welfare check. On May 13, 2012, officers entered Estrella's Burbank condominium. Inside, they discovered her body in the bathtub. What began as concern for her safety instantly became a homicide investigation. The contrast was stark. A wedding celebration on Friday night, silence on Saturday, and a body discovered by Sunday. From the outset, investigators focused on Jimenez. He was the last person known to be with Estrella. After the wedding night, he did not contact police, emergency services, or family members. He did not return to the scene. Instead, he disappeared. His absence became one of the most significant elements of the case. On May 15, 2012, Jimenez was formally charged with first-degree murder in Cook County. By that time, he had already fled. Authorities began searching for him while also working to locate the vehicle involved in the crime. In September 2012, police found the black Maserati inside a garage belonging to Jimenez's brother in Chicago. Blood evidence inside the car confirmed that Estrella had been attacked inside the vehicle, solidifying investigators' reconstruction of events. Despite locating the car, Jimenez remained missing for years. The case shifted from an active homicide investigation into a prolonged fugitive search. Estrella's family endured year after year without a trial, without testimony, and without accountability. The wedding that marked the start of a marriage instead became the timestamp of a loss that never entered the courtroom. If you enjoy watching true crime stories, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I've got lots of interesting videos coming up. Thank you very much. The fourth case. Tyrek Burton was 37 years old when he was killed, roughly 7 hours after marrying his longtime partner, Kiara Holloway, also referred to as Kiara Burton, following their wedding. The wedding marked a milestone that had taken years to reach. Reports state the couple had been together for more than a decade. Some accounts say 13 years, others closer to 16. This was not a rushed union or a fleeting romance. It was a long-awaited moment, surrounded by family, friends, and the shared belief that this day finally formalized a life they had already been building together. The ceremony took place in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the Barber Park Events Center. Everything about the day pointed forward. Photographs captured smiles meant to last. Guests spoke about the future, about stability, about what came next. Weddings are designed to present certainty, public proof that two people have chosen permanence. And for everyone in attendance, that certainty felt real. As the evening progressed, the celebration began to wind down. Around 8:49 p.m., Tyrek briefly left the venue. Family members later clarified that he did not leave to end the night or separate from his wife. He stepped away with the intention of returning to pick her up. It was meant to be a short, ordinary moment, one of those small, logistical movements that happen constantly during large events. Instead, that brief departure became the dividing line between celebration and catastrophe. According to investigators and family members, a stranger followed Tyrek back to Barber Park. Reports indicate the individual claimed Tyrek had cut him off at a stop sign nearby. There was no prior connection between them, no shared history, just a fleeting interaction on the road that escalated into a pursuit. The stranger followed Tyrek into the parking lot of the very place where the wedding had just taken place. The confrontation happened quickly. What was said between them has not been fully detailed publicly, but authorities have consistently described the incident as a road rage encounter. Shots were fired in the parking lot. Tyrek was struck. The violence occurred in front of his new bride and one of his daughters, turning a space associated with joy, family, and safety into an immediate crime scene. Emergency responders were called, but Tyrek's injuries were fatal. He was pronounced dead that night. The marriage certificate had been signed only hours earlier. By the end of the evening, his wife was no longer a newlywed in the way anyone imagines. She was a widow standing in the same location where she had just celebrated the beginning of her life with him. The setting is impossible to separate from the impact. This was not an isolated roadside miles away from home. This was the Barber Park Events Center itself. The transition from wedding venue to homicide scene happened without distance, without time to process, and without warning. Guests who had gathered for a celebration were suddenly confronted with police activity, flashing lights, and disbelief. Tyrek Burton's death was not the result of a long-standing feud or a known threat. It stemmed from a moment of anger carried into a space that should have been safe. Investigators focused on reconstructing the movements of both vehicles, reviewing surveillance footage, and gathering witness statements from those present. The central question was simple but devastating. How did a brief traffic interaction escalate into lethal violence within minutes? As of late 2025, Greensboro police had made no arrests in the case. The lack of resolution has left Tyrek's family living with unanswered questions. They know the broad outline of what happened, but not who ultimately pulled the trigger or why the confrontation escalated so far. Each passing month without an arrest has extended the trauma, keeping the night open rather than allowing it to close. The fifth case. 27th October. 2021 began as a wedding day. In England, Dawn Walker, aged 52, married Thomas Nutt, 46, at a register office. To those who saw them, the day appeared ordinary. There was no public argument, no visible disturbance, no sign that the hours ahead would end in violence. Photographs were taken, formalities completed, and the couple left as husband and wife. By the end of that same night, Dawn Walker was dead. After the ceremony, the newly married couple returned to their home in Lightcliffe, near Halifax, West Yorkshire. What happened inside that house occurred away from guests and witnesses. Forensic evidence and prosecution findings later established that Dawn was killed within hours of returning from the wedding. The cause of death was strangulation, caused by sustained pressure applied to her neck. This was not an accident or a sudden collapse. The evidence showed deliberate force, applied long enough to end her life. The timing of the killing is central to the case. There was no honeymoon together. There was no first morning as a married couple. The transition from vows to violence occurred the same night. Dawn never left the house alive after returning from the wedding. The symbolism of marriage, trust, safety, and permanence collapsed almost immediately behind closed doors. What followed was not a call for help or an admission of what had happened. Instead, prosecutors showed that Dawn's body was first hidden inside a kitchen cupboard in the home. Later, it was forced into a suitcase. The suitcase was then dumped in bushes close to the property. These actions required time and effort. They happened after the killing, when decisions were being made about concealment rather than emergency. For 4 days, Dawn was not reported missing. During that period, Thomas Nutt went alone to a caravan park in Skegness, referring to the trip as a honeymoon. Dawn's body remained hidden. Family members and others were unable to contact her, but no alarm was raised immediately. The gap between the killing and the report would later become a major focus of the investigation. On 31st October 2021, 4 days after the wedding night, Nutt formally reported Dawn missing. Prosecutors would later describe this report as a ghastly charade. His account suggested she had disappeared after they went out together. Almost immediately, investigators began to identify inconsistencies between what he told police and what the evidence showed. One of the most significant pieces of evidence came from CCTV footage. Cameras recorded Nutt wheeling the suitcase out of the house at the same moment a police officer arrived to take the missing person report. The image captured the contradiction at the heart of the case, a man presenting himself as a concerned husband while actively removing evidence of his wife's death. Police searches soon focused on the area near the house. Dawn Walker's body was found inside the suitcase, hidden in nearby bushes. The discovery confirmed that she had been killed inside her home and deliberately concealed. There was no indication of anyone else being involved. The physical evidence pointed squarely back to the person who had last been with her. As the case moved toward trial, further context emerged. Although the murder occurred on the wedding night, the relationship had not been free of violence beforehand. Neighbors and family members testified to a prolonged history of domestic abuse and controlling behavior by Nutt before the marriage. There had been earlier violent incidents. The wedding had taken place against a background of fear that was largely hidden from public view. This clarification matters. The killing was not the first sign of danger in the relationship. It was the most extreme act in a pattern that had already been established privately. What made the case so shocking was that the violence reached its lethal point on a day meant to represent commitment and safety. In August 2022, after an 11-day trial, a jury found Thomas Nutt guilty of murder. The court rejected any suggestion that the killing was accidental or the result of a momentary loss of control. The evidence showed intent, followed by calculated steps to hide the crime and mislead authorities. Nutt was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 21 years before parole eligibility. In passing sentence, the judge emphasized the seriousness of murdering a spouse, particularly under circumstances involving concealment, deception, and betrayal of trust. The sixth case. A wedding night is meant to be a pause in time, the moment after the vows, after the applause, when the future finally begins without interruption. On April 28, 2023, that pause lasted only minutes for Samantha Miller, who had just married Arik Hutchinson along the coast of Folly Beach, South Carolina. The ceremony and reception unfolded without incident. Friends and family gathered, photographs were taken, and the celebration ended as weddings often do, quietly, with guests dispersing into the night. Samantha and Arik left the reception in a golf cart, a common and accepted mode of transportation in Folly Beach, where roads are narrow, speed limits are low, and golf carts routinely share space with cars, bicycles, and pedestrians. 2 relatives rode with them. It was not a risky choice, it was a normal one. They never made it to their destination. Shortly before 10 p.m., as the golf cart traveled along a residential stretch of road, it was struck from behind by a vehicle moving at extreme speed. The force of the collision was catastrophic. The golf cart was destroyed. Samantha suffered fatal injuries. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but she died from her injuries, only hours after becoming a bride. Arik Hutchinson and the other passengers survived, though they were seriously injured and required extended medical care. The scene that followed bore no resemblance to the celebration that had ended minutes earlier. The wedding dress was torn. The road was littered with debris. Sirens replaced music. What had been a beginning became an ending without warning. The driver of the vehicle was identified as Jamie Lee Komorowski, a 25-year-old woman who, according to police records and later court filings, had spent the evening drinking at multiple bars. Investigators determined that Komorowski was traveling at approximately 65 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Toxicology tests showed her blood alcohol concentration was more than 3 times the legal limit. There was no evidence of braking before impact. This was not a highway. It was not an unlit road. It was a known shared space where golf carts regularly operate. The risk was visible. The outcome was entirely preventable. Samantha's death sent shockwaves far beyond Folly Beach. Images from earlier that night, Samantha smiling in her wedding dress, standing beside her husband, circulated alongside reports of the crash. The contrast was stark and immediate. A woman who had just begun a marriage was now being remembered publicly before her first day as a wife had ended. For Arik Hutchinson, the loss was compounded by trauma. He survived the crash but awoke in a hospital without his wife. In later statements, he described the disorientation of learning that the person he had married hours earlier was gone. The injuries he sustained were serious, but they were survivable. The loss of Samantha was not. The criminal case moved forward swiftly because the evidence was clear. Prosecutors charged Komorowski with multiple felonies, including DUI causing death and reckless homicide. The investigation relied on surveillance footage, crash reconstruction, witness testimony, and toxicology results. There was no dispute over speed, no dispute over intoxication, no dispute over responsibility. In December 2024, Komorowski pleaded guilty to the charges. The plea brought an end to the trial phase and spared Samantha's family from a prolonged court battle. She was later sentenced to 25 years in prison, reflecting both the severity of the conduct and the irreversible consequences of her actions. While the criminal case addressed guilt, it did not address loss. That process took place separately through civil litigation. Samantha's family and Arik Hutchinson pursued wrongful death claims against all parties deemed legally liable. These claims involved multiple insurance policies and required extensive negotiation. In 2025, the civil cases were resolved through a series of settlements. According to court records and confirmed reporting, the combined gross settlement total from all liable parties was approximately $1.3 million. That figure, however, did not reflect what ultimately reached Samantha's husband. After legal fees, litigation costs, and prior distributions were deducted, Arik Hutchinson's personal recovery from the final insurance portion was approximately $104,000. 7th case. According to investigators, Stepan Dolgic believed that his bride had behaved incorrectly with another male guest during their wedding celebration. Alcohol intensified that belief, turning suspicion into rage. What began as a fixation became a justification in his mind. That motive, possessive jealousy mixed with intoxication, set the course for everything that followed, and explains why the violence erupted while the celebration was still underway, not hours later in private. The bride was Oksana Poludentseva. The wedding day had not yet ended. Guests were present. Music was playing. Alcohol was being shared. The setting still carried the weight of tradition and expectation. Within that environment, Dolgik's anger surfaced openly. Witnesses later described how his behavior shifted as the evening progressed, culminating in a violent outburst that no one attending a wedding expects to confront. Oksana's relationship with Dolgik had already been shaped by risk long before the ceremony. He was an ex-convict with prior convictions for murder and robbery. Reports state that the two met while he was incarcerated, corresponding as pen pals before beginning a relationship. Despite that background, the relationship advanced toward marriage. By the time the wedding arrived, concerns about his past had been absorbed into a narrative of reform and commitment. The ceremony itself reinforced that narrative, creating a powerful assumption that the danger belonged in the past. The violence began during the wedding celebration, not after it ended. According to reporting cited by investigators, Dolgik first attacked Oksana outdoors, in the yard or street area near the gathering. Witnesses saw him begin punching and kicking her. This was not a brief altercation, it was sustained and escalating. Guests immediately realized the situation was serious, but seriousness did not translate into control. Some guests did attempt to intervene. Official reports clarify that these efforts were met with aggression. Dolgik was physically intimidating and refused to stop. Those who stepped in were rebuffed, threatened, or forced back. His prior reputation and escalating violence made continued physical intervention dangerous. The scene shifted from confusion to fear as people recognized that stopping him might result in further harm. As the assault continued, Oksana was dragged into the house. The change of location did not bring relief or separation. The violence continued inside, then moved back outside again. The attack unfolded across multiple spaces connected to the wedding itself, yard, house, and street, making it impossible to frame as a private dispute removed from public view. Guests were watching a celebration transform into a prolonged assault in real time. When it became clear that physical intervention was no longer safe or effective, bystanders turned to emergency response. Calls were placed to the Russian National Guard. This decision reflected fear, not indifference. People understood the danger but lacked the means to stop a violent individual who was already out of control. By the time it was clear that Oksana was no longer responsive, the attack had already reached its fatal outcome. The brutality did not end with her death. Instead of seeking medical help or waiting for authorities, Dolgik moved Oksana's body and dumped it into a nearby ravine. Investigators later emphasized this act as evidence of intent and awareness. It showed that the violence had progressed beyond impulsive rage into deliberate action aimed at discarding the consequences. Oksana's body was later discovered, prompting a full criminal investigation. The Russian Investigative Committee documented the sequence of events in detail: the alcohol consumption, the jealous motive, the visible assault witnessed by guests, the failed attempts at intervention, and the disposal of the body. Witness testimony played a critical role. This was not a hidden crime pieced together only through forensic reconstruction. It was a public act that unfolded while people struggled to understand what they were seeing. That struggle reflects a phenomenon often described as delayed recognition. Weddings carry extraordinary symbolic weight. They signal legitimacy, safety, and social approval. When violence erupts within that symbol, the human response is often disbelief. Guests initially search for explanations that fit the setting: intoxication, argument, stress, momentary loss of control. These explanations delay the recognition that a homicide is occurring, even when evidence is visible. In this case, delayed recognition existed alongside fear. Some guests acted and were physically rebuffed. Others hesitated because confronting a violent, intoxicated man posed a real risk. The setting itself worked against swift clarity. A wedding is not a context in which people expect lethal violence, and that expectation slowed the moment when the situation was fully understood for what it was. The legal outcome was decisive. Dolgik was arrested, charged, and prosecuted for murder. In 2022, a Russian court convicted him. He was sentenced to 18 years in a strict regime penal colony. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime, the public nature of the assault, his prior convictions, and the deliberate actions taken after Oksana's death. The court rejected any suggestion that the killing was accidental or excusable. The verdict closed the judicial process, but it did not resolve the deeper implications of the case. Oksana Poludentseva was not killed in secrecy. She was killed in a setting defined by celebration, tradition, and social expectation. The very symbol meant to represent safety became the environment that delayed recognition and limited intervention. The 8 case. Margaret Lofty married George Smith, believing she had secured a future that felt stable and legitimate. The ceremony itself passed quietly, witnessed and socially approved. Names were signed into the register, hands were shaken. Nothing about that public moment suggested danger, but this story was never shaped by what happened in front of other people. Its defining moments unfolded later, when the celebration ended and privacy took over. The man Margaret married was not who he claimed to be. He was George Joseph Smith, a serial bigamist who moved through England under a web of aliases, including John Lloyd and Henry Williams. Smith did not choose his wives randomly. He sought out women who lived alone, women with savings, wills, or insurance policies, and women whose personal affairs would not be closely monitored. Marriage gave him legitimacy. Isolation gave him control. Margaret Lofty died in 1914, shortly after her marriage. She was found drowned in a bathtub inside a lodging house on Bismarck Road in Highgate, London. The door was closed. There were no witnesses, no signs of disturbance, no visible injuries. In keeping with the assumptions of the time, the coroner ruled her death accidental. A woman bathing alone was not considered suspicious. Privacy itself worked as an explanation. The same conclusion had already been reached the year before, when Alice Burnham died. Alice married Smith in 1913 and was soon found drowned in a bathtub in her rented accommodation. Once again, the scene was quiet. No cries were reported. No struggle was visible. Smith appeared as the composed, grieving husband, handling practical matters and presenting himself as cooperative and distressed. Her death was recorded as accidental drowning, and the case closed. Before both of them, there had been Bessie Mundy. Bessie Mundy married Smith under yet another false name and died in 1912 while staying in a seaside lodging house in Herne Bay. She too was found submerged in a bathtub. She too had no obvious injuries. She too had recently arranged financial matters that benefited her husband. Her death, like the others, was ruled a misadventure. Each case was treated as an isolated domestic tragedy, examined on its own and quickly put aside. What linked these deaths was not geography or shared acquaintances, but repetition hidden behind privacy. Each woman died alone. Each death occurred behind a closed door. Each investigation relied on appearances and social assumptions rather than scrutiny. Bathrooms were private spaces. Wives were presumed safe. Husbands were trusted. The absence of witnesses did not provoke suspicion. It reassured authorities that nothing criminal had occurred. Smith's broader history only became clear later. He did not marry only 3 women. Investigators eventually determined that he had married at least 7 and possibly as many as 8 women, all while already legally married. Most of those wives survived, not because they were less vulnerable, but because Smith chose a different outcome. In some marriages, he robbed them of money, accessed their savings, or manipulated wills, then abandoned them. In others, he insured them and waited for the right conditions. Survival depended not on chance, but on Smith's intent. His financial motive went beyond insurance. Smith actively targeted life savings and wills, and in his earliest cases alone, he obtained approximately £2,800 from his first 2 victims, a staggering sum in the early 20th century. Marriage allowed him legal access. Death, in selected cases, made that access permanent. The pattern was not uncovered by a sudden breakthrough within law enforcement. It emerged because individuals outside the system noticed what official processes had missed. After Alice Burnham's death, her father, Charles Burnham, was troubled by the circumstances and by how quickly the case had been dismissed. Months later, when newspapers reported another bathtub drowning under eerily similar circumstances, the resemblance stood out. Separately, a landlady named Margaret Crossley also recognized the parallels while reading coverage of what became known as the Highgate Mystery. Both alerted the authorities. Their observations forced investigators to place the deaths side by side for the first time. Once aligned, the repetition was unmistakable. 3 marriages, 3 short intervals between wedding and death, 3 bathtubs. Three financial benefits flowing to the same man under different names. What had once looked like coincidence now appeared methodical. The prosecution that followed became known as the Brides in the Bath. George Joseph Smith was formally charged with the murder of Bessie Mundy, the earliest of the three deaths. The deaths of Alice Burnham and Margaret Lofty were introduced as system evidence, not as separate charges, but to prove intent, method, and design. This legal strategy allowed the court to see the full pattern that individual investigations had obscured. The trial, held at the Old Bailey in June 1915, marked a turning point in British legal history. Central to the case was forensic pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury, whose testimony challenged deeply held assumptions about drowning. Spilsbury explained that an adult woman could be drowned in a bathtub quickly and without leaving visible marks. To demonstrate this, the court heard evidence involving a female diver who showed how pulling a victim's legs in a confined bath could trigger vagal inhibition, a sudden physiological response causing immediate unconsciousness, followed by drowning. The demonstration reframed everything: the stillness of the scenes, the lack of defensive wounds, the absence of chaos. These were no longer signs of accident. They were signs of control. Smith did not rely on prolonged violence. He relied on surprise, positioning, and the certainty that no one would intervene once the door was closed. The jury convicted Smith of murder. On August 13, 1915, he was executed by hanging at Maidstone Prison. Though the conviction addressed only one death, the verdict acknowledged a broader reality. Margaret Lofty and Alice Burnham were no longer viewed as unfortunate accidents. They were recognized as victims of the same calculated method. The ninth case. According to police statements later cited by Reuters and Thai national media, he retrieved a legally owned 9mm handgun from the vehicle. Investigators confirmed that the weapon was registered. Inside the hall, guests remained unaware of what was unfolding beyond the doors. Moments earlier, the wedding reception was still moving at an ordinary pace. Music played softly through the venue. Conversations overlapped at round tables. Plates were being cleared as guests relaxed into the evening. In Wang Nam Kiao district in Thailand's Nakhon Ratchasima province, the ceremony had already ended, and the reception marked the point where formality gave way to relief. For those inside, the most significant event of the day felt complete. At the center of that celebration was Kanchana Pachuntwek, 44. She had just married Chaturong Suksuk, a 29-year-old former soldier and decorated para-athlete. Police later confirmed that the wedding ceremony itself passed without incident. There was no public argument during the ritual. Guests applauded, photographs were taken. To those in attendance, nothing during the vows suggested danger or instability. The shift occurred after the ceremony, during the reception. As the evening progressed, Chaturong consumed alcohol. Investigators later confirmed that he was quite intoxicated by the time of the shooting. While most guests remained focused on the celebration, police said a private argument took place shortly before the violence. Authorities described the dispute only as involving personal matters. It did not occur on the main floor and was not witnessed by most attendees. What followed was not gradual. Multiple reports indicate that Chaturong left the reception abruptly. Witnesses described his departure as sudden and unexplained, something that stood out only after the fact. There was no announcement, no visible confrontation in the hall. Music continued. Guests remained seated. To those inside, the evening appeared uninterrupted. Outside the venue, Chaturong walked to his car. That is when, according to police, he retrieved the handgun. Inside the hall, nothing had changed. Guests continued talking. Some were focused on their phones. Others were laughing quietly. The doors remained closed, and no one inside had any indication of what was about to happen. When Chaturong returned, the transition from celebration to violence took only seconds. He entered the reception area and opened fire. Kanchana Pachuntwek was struck and collapsed. Her mother was shot. Her sister was shot. Another wedding guest was also hit. Panic tore through the hall instantly. Chairs overturned. Tables were pushed aside. People screamed and ran in different directions, some dropping to the floor, others fleeing toward the exits. The music stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-note. Kanchana died at the scene. Her mother and sister were fatally wounded. A fourth victim, a guest attending the wedding, later died from gunshot injuries. Moments after the shooting, Chaturong turned the gun on himself. He died at the venue before emergency responders could intervene. By the time police arrived, the wedding reception hall had become a secured crime scene. Royal Thai police officers worked through the night, interviewing witnesses and reconstructing the timeline. Investigators confirmed the sequence clearly: a peaceful ceremony, a reception underway, a private argument out of public view, the groom's sudden departure, his return with a firearm, and the shooting in front of guests. Authorities emphasized that no public argument occurred during the ceremony itself, a point repeated consistently in official briefings. As the investigation continued, police provided additional context about Chaturang's state of mind in the period leading up to the wedding. Officers and guests told reporters that he had previously expressed deep insecurities related to the 15-year age gap between himself and Kanchana. Others referenced his sensitivity surrounding his physical disability, despite his achievements as a para-athlete. These concerns, investigators said, had been voiced before the wedding but were not regarded by those around him as warning signs of imminent violence. Authorities were careful not to frame these factors as definitive motives. Instead, they described a convergence of circumstances, confirmed intoxication, emotional strain, and a private dispute shortly before the shooting. Police stated clearly that there was no evidence that Kanchana or her family anticipated danger that night. News of the attack spread rapidly across Thailand and internationally. Media outlets reported on the shock of a bride being killed at her own wedding reception, alongside members of her family in front of guests. Chaturang's background as a former soldier and ASEAN Paragames medalist intensified public disbelief. The setting, a wedding reception, a space associated with unity and renewal, made the violence particularly difficult for many to process. In Wang Nam Kiao, the aftermath was immediate. Celebratory decorations were removed. The venue emptied. Families gathered not for congratulations, but for mourning. Wedding rituals were replaced by funeral rites. Photographs meant for albums became records of a moment frozen just before everything changed. After the ceremony ends, grief does not resolve. It stretches forward. Anniversaries arrive stripped of meaning. Wedding dates become reminders rather than milestones. Families learn how to gather again without expecting familiar voices in the room. Communities offer support in the days that follow, then slowly return to routine. Families do not. They rebuild identity in fragments, learning how to live alongside absence. The 10th case. Family members told reporters the couple appeared content throughout the wedding day. Guests echoed that observation. There were no reports of an argument during the ceremony. No public confrontation during the reception before the shooting. Later media reports referenced claims of extreme jealousy in the relationship, but these accounts were not formal findings released by police. Authorities did not present evidence of a specific triggering event during the reception itself. Rogerio Damascena and Renata Alexandre Costa Coelho had gathered nearly 200 friends and relatives for their wedding reception at a yacht club in Recife in December 2010. The venue, overlooking the water, was chosen for the celebration. Music played, tables were full, the mood was relaxed in the way large receptions often become once formalities give way to conversation and dancing. For the guests, this was a familiar rhythm, one that signals safety through tradition. As the night progressed, nothing outwardly disturbed that sense of order. No disruption drew attention from staff or guests, no raised voices that would have prompted concern. People later recalled the couple moving through the room, greeting guests, posing for photos, and participating in the expected rituals of a wedding reception. The scene, by all available accounts, was ordinary in the best sense of the word. At one point, Rogerio Damascena took the microphone. In a room accustomed to toasts and announcements, the gesture did not stand out. He told the guests he had a surprise. The word carried no alarm. It functioned as a cue, drawing eyes forward and quieting conversations. Guests waited. Some smiled. No one moved to leave. Damascena then walked away from the reception area. Outside the yacht club, parked nearby, was a pickup truck belonging to his father. Inside that vehicle was a .38 caliber revolver. Police later confirmed the weapon had been hidden there before the event began. This detail would become central to the investigation. The gun was not obtained spontaneously from the reception space. It had been positioned in advance, out of sight, accessible only by a deliberate choice to leave the room and retrieve it. When Damascena returned, the shift was immediate and irreversible. In front of the assembled guests, he opened fire, Renata Alexandre Costa Coelho, 25 years old, was struck. Marcelo Guimarães, the best man, was also shot. Both died at the scene. A third person, Renata's brother, was wounded by gunfire and survived after being taken for medical treatment. Panic erupted across the reception hall. Guests ran for exits, ducked behind tables, and scrambled for cover as the celebration collapsed into chaos. Seconds later, Rogério Damascena turned the revolver on himself and died by suicide. There was no attempt to flee and no prolonged confrontation. The violence happened in full view of approximately 200 witnesses and ended almost as quickly as it began. By the time emergency responders arrived, 2 people were dead, 1 was injured, and the groom lay lifeless on the floor of the reception venue. What had moments earlier been a place of celebration became a sealed crime scene. Police moved quickly to reconstruct the sequence of events. Statements from guests were taken. The revolver was recovered. Investigators confirmed the order of the shootings and the identities of the victims. The setting was established beyond dispute. The killings occurred during the wedding reception, not after it, and not in a private residence. The announcement of a surprise, the walk to the pickup truck, the retrieval of the weapon, and the return to the reception hall formed a clear, documented timeline. One conclusion emerged with particular weight. Police investigator João Brito stated that the act was premeditated, citing the fact that Damascena had hidden the firearm in a vehicle before the reception began. The placement of the weapon required planning. It required forethought. It indicated that the decision to use lethal force was not formed in a single, impulsive moment on the dance floor. Despite that determination, authorities did not announce an official motive. There was no suicide note released. No public explanation was offered by the perpetrator before his death. Investigators did not identify a specific incident during the reception that triggered the shooting. The record remained anchored to what could be proven: preparation, execution, and outcome. In the days that followed, coverage across Brazil reflected both the clarity and the limits of the investigation. Reports stated the facts plainly. Renata Alexandre Costa Coelho and Marcelo Guimarães were killed. Renata's brother was wounded. Rogério Damascena died by suicide. The weapon had been concealed beforehand. The reception had been crowded. The absence of a confirmed motive became part of the story, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a boundary that reporting would not cross without evidence. 11th case. After the guests dispersed, Shivani and Pradeep retired to a bedroom in the house. What happened next unfolded entirely out of sight. According to police investigations and later forensic findings, an argument broke out between them during the night. At first, investigators publicly stated that there was no clear motive. There were no prior police reports, no documented history of domestic conflict, and no complaints from either family. Early descriptions framed the incident as sudden, emerging without warning. The wedding itself had taken place on March 7, 2025. It was an arranged marriage, planned roughly within a year, and relatives from both sides later told investigators that the couple appeared happy during the engagement period. There were no known disputes before the ceremony, no visible tension during the rituals, no moments that stood out to guests as unusual or concerning. By the time the celebrations ended, the night carried the familiar weight of exhaustion and expectation that follows most weddings. Shivani was 22 years old. She was a student who had studied up to the 8th grade and had just entered a new household, one shaped by customs that emphasize privacy, adjustment, and restraint. Pradeep was 24 and worked as a tile laborer. After the ceremony, Shivani moved into his family's home in the Sadat Ganj area of Ayodhya. For everyone awake in the house that night, the transition appeared routine. The couple went inside their room. The door closed. The house quieted. As the investigation progressed, that quiet became central to understanding what followed. Later reports by ETV Bharat and Bhaskar English revealed that investigators examining Pradeep's phone found what they described as a fabricated message. According to police interpretations cited in those reports, Pradeep allegedly sent a message to himself from another number. Investigators believe the message was created to provoke or confront Shivani about a suspected past relationship. This suspicion reportedly intensified after Shivani did not bring her mobile phone with her to her in-laws' house following the wedding. That detail mattered. Shivani's absence of a phone meant she was isolated in a new environment, without direct contact with her own family, and without a personal device that might have offered reassurance or escape. Investigators believe the fabricated message became the trigger that escalated the argument already unfolding behind the closed door. What followed was not simply a disagreement. Post-mortem examinations later confirmed that Shivani died by strangulation. Forensic teams documented nail marks on her neck, indicating that she struggled during the assault. The presence of those marks established that the violence was not instantaneous or passive. Shivani resisted. The struggle occurred within a confined space, during a night when silence was expected and privacy was assumed. Despite the physical struggle, no neighbors reported hearing raised voices, cries, or sounds of distress. That absence of reported noise did not indicate calm. It reflected how contained the violence was and how effectively it remained hidden within a space socially understood as untouchable. After killing Shivani, Pradeep took his own life by hanging. Police believe the suicide occurred shortly afterward, during the same night. The room remained locked from the inside. The discovery came the next morning, around 7 a.m. on March 9th. Family members noticed that the newly married couple had not come out of their room. Initially, the delay did not immediately trigger an alarm. Newlyweds are expected to remain secluded. Silence in that context is interpreted as privacy rather than danger. But as time passed and calls went unanswered, concern grew. When relatives forced the door open, they found Shivani dead and Pradeep hanging inside. The locked door became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, no indication of outside involvement. The physical evidence inside the room supported the conclusion that the events unfolded between the two alone. Both bodies were sent for post-mortem examinations, which confirmed the causes of death and aligned with police findings. What unsettled both families and investigators was not uncertainty about responsibility, but the absence of a visible past that might have signaled risk. There were no prior complaints, no documented disputes. Relatives from both sides reiterated that the marriage had appeared stable. This lack of history shaped early narratives, leading many initial reports to describe the tragedy as sudden and inexplicable. But the later discovery of the fabricated message shifted that understanding. It suggested not randomness, but escalation. Not inevitability, but a confrontation engineered in a moment of suspicion and control. The argument did not emerge from nowhere. It was ignited deliberately in a setting where Shivani was newly arrived, isolated, and without her phone. The structure of the night mattered. Weddings compress pressure, fatigue, emotional intensity, and performance into a narrow window of hours. By the time Shivani and Pradeep were alone, they had already passed through a day defined by obligation and scrutiny. When suspicion surfaced, it did so behind a closed door reinforced by cultural norms that discourage interruption. This is where social assumptions quietly shape outcomes. A wedding night is treated as private, protected, and beyond questioning. Silence is normalized. A locked door is expected. Those assumptions did not cause the violence, but they delayed recognition that something had gone wrong. No one intervened during the night because nothing outwardly broke the expected pattern. The forensic evidence tells a different story. Shivani fought. The lack of sound did not mean the absence of violence. It meant the violence occurred where no one was listening. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the sequence became clear. The wedding on March 7th, the return to the groom's house, the night between March 8th and 9th, the fabricated message, the argument, the struggle, the locked room, the discovery around 7 a.m. Each detail narrowed the window in which the tragedy occurred and removed speculation about outside involvement. Shivani's death is not defined only by the act that ended her life, but by how completely that act was hidden until morning. She did not disappear. She did not leave unanswered questions about location or identity. She was there, behind a closed door, in a space assumed to be safe because of what it represented. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel.